Hello to all attendees in Australia and kia ora to our friends in Aotearoa. Welcome to the seminar on providing natural solutions through connecting landscapes. My name is Penelope Figgis and I am the Vice Chair for Oceania of the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas and a former Director of the Australian Committee for IUCN. Before we begin, as we are speaking about the wonder and beauty of our beautiful two islands and how we're going to work together to restore and protect them, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I live, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and future. Our seminar is being held thanks to the creation earlier this year of CALLANZ. CALLANZ is Conserving Across Large Landscapes, Australia and New Zealand, a wonderful connection of our two countries. And the key groups involved are Reconnecting Northland, New Zealand, Gondwana Link in Western Australia, and the Great Eastern Ranges, which covers the three eastern states of Australia. I'm going to quickly run through our agenda. Our first speaker is my good friend, Virginia Young, and she will be our keynote for the day. And that's followed by 5 excellent speakers. And then finally, we'll have a question and answer. We have a lot to get through, so I'm going to ask all speakers to keep to time. All attendees have been put automatically on mute, so please stay on mute. The webinar is being recorded and we look forward to distributing that afterwards, and that is something that you can pass on to other people who can't be here today. Also, please do send through questions. We want to hear what you want to know from these experts, and please put that in a question and answer box, which will be available on your screens. Also, vote for those questions, then we'll know which things are of particular interest to our audience. I should have said perhaps that we have over 200 registrations, which is absolutely marvellous and really underscores how important that this issue is. And at the end of it, we are going to put up a short questionnaire. So could you please answer that, because everybody always needs feedback. I've been asked to give a brief overview of the international context on nature-based solutions from an IUCN perspective and identify some drivers of the connectivity approach which we all support and which we're discussing today. So could I have my first slide, please? Look, the basic purpose of this slide is simply to say, to underscore the world is really at a critical moment. And the key crises remain: the totally inequitable world that we face, which needs sustainability across all sectors, a world increasingly ravaged by climate change disasters, the disastrous loss of the Earth's ecosystems and species, and of course, the pandemic. However, what I've called the confluence of crises is in a bizarre way the light on the horizon, as it's led to an unprecedented call for global transformation of human society and economies to ones which recognise that to live more equitably and sustainably on this finite Earth, to greatly reduce climate change impacts, to halt the extinction crisis and avoid pandemics, we must treat the natural world as the fabric which sustains all life and both protect and restore it. Next slide, thanks. And the extraordinary thing is that the world has woken up to this, and new voices are coming out all the time. Last year, I collated a lot of these speeches because there were so many. So, for example, the UN Secretary General says we must stop the war on nature and has spoken out many, many times on this issue. And the views that transformative change is urgent have come from so many sectors, not just our environmental sectors, but major international institutions from the EU to the World Bank so many political leaders, business leaders, academics, religious thinkers, as well as outstanding individuals from civil society. In a dark time for the world, it's provided a hope of a more rational and just future based on science and the respect for life. Next slide, please. And so finally, it's manifesting in many, many forms. And of course, the word nature-based solution is coming up more and more, as we are going to discuss today. And basically, it's appearing in green recovery plans, for example, the European Green Deal or the Canadian Green Recovery Plan, which has got $17.6 billion allocated to it. It's arriving in the private sector in many forms. For example, the We Mean Business Coalition with 150 global companies urging governments around the world to align their recovery plans with ecosystem repair and climate science. And the IUCN World Congress, which is currently on, is replete with calls for nature-based solutions of many kinds, including very prominently sustainable agriculture. And we will see in the next little while some key things coming out of the international community, like the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, that clearly has nature-based solutions at its heart, and the 30-30 rule, which is, or goal, which is going to be critical, of 30% of land and sea protected. And of course, the Glasgow Climate Change Conference, which I'm sure Virginia will speak about a great deal, and with a much greater emphasis on the role of biodiversity and land management in mitigation and adaptation. And finally, the UN Restoration, a decade of ecosystem restoration, which is going to be a major global priority. And last slide. Basically, I think all of these give a context to what we're discussing today. We are part of a global understanding, and it is and Gondwana and Reconnecting Northland and GER are part of our great contribution to this, because we do need to connect protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures into large ecological networks. And I'm going to stop there because I could go on to some of the things that we can do, but I'm sure they will come up all during the discussion. So now I'd like to introduce my good colleague, Virginia Young, and our keynote speaker. So Virginia has been a major figure in the conservation movement for many, many years. She currently contributes to the International Research Project on Primary Forests led by Griffith University, and they are working to increase understanding of the linkages between climate, biodiversity, and ecosystem integrity. So important. Her voluntary roles include the chair of Gondwana Link and the board member of the Great Eastern Ranges Initiative, whose goal is collaborative, connective conservation programs that deliver robust, integrated climate and biodiversity outcomes. Virginia is a past president of the Australian Committee for IUCN, and she continues to support the work of IUCN through involvement with the IUCN Task Force on Primary Forests, which includes intact forest landscapes, and the World Commission on Protected Areas Climate Change Specialist Group. Thank you very much, Virginia.
Thank you, Penny. That's a wonderful introduction, and welcome everybody. Today I'm speaking to you from Ngunnawal country in Canberra, and I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past and present. As Penny mentioned, my day job has taken me into the heart of the two great challenges facing us all, the climate crisis and biodiversity crisis. Next slide, please. Now, it may surprise many people listening to this to contemplate, I suppose, just how difficult it has been and continues to be to get climate policymakers to understand that climate change isn't just bad for biodiversity. I think they do get that, But what they are struggling to comprehend is that the feedback loops between biodiversity and climate change flow both ways. And what this means for effective action on climate change is that biodiversity loss and resulting ecosystem decline actually increase greenhouse gas emissions and future risk of greenhouse gas emissions from ecosystems. And why this is so critically important to understand is there's more carbon stored in ecosystems than there is in our fossil fuel reserves. So increasing understanding of this relationship and just how central biodiversity and ecosystem integrity are to the stability of long-term carbon storage in our ecosystems and the success of future sequestration is a really critical part of the work that I do. And we are, as this diagram illustrates, we are spiraling down at the moment as both crises amplify each other. But it's really very straightforward to spiral up, stop the damage and start restoring. Next slide, please. Now, I'd just like us to pause for a moment because it became incredibly obvious during the 2019-20 bushfires in Australia that there was a clear linkage between the past damage to ecosystems and forest ecosystems and climate change. And if you want to see a really comprehensive analysis, scientific analysis of the various factors in those summer fires, go to that Bushfire Facts website, or it's available also on the GER website. So the science analysis is there, and the beginnings of the citizen science response looking at post-bushfire recovery is also described on that website. Next slide, please. And let's go to the next one. No one needs to be reminded of that. Now, it is really clear that that catastrophic fire season was primarily driven by climate change. But what's less clear and is still contested is the role of past management in increasing fire severity and risk. So one of the reports on that website I just mentioned, Bushfire Facts Report number 3, looks at that relationship and assesses all of the scientific peer-reviewed science on the issue. And it is now crystal clear that fire risk and fire severity is greater in younger, simplified forests than in long unlogged and more complex old forests. Next slide, please. Now, Penny mentioned, there is increasing momentum to bring climate and biodiversity policy together. They've been traditionally dealt with in silos, and silos that are incredibly reluctant to talk to each other. That's the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Convention on Biological Diversity. Now, there are moves, and I'll refer to them in the next few slides. There are some really important moves within those conventions themselves to break down the silos, but we are still a very long way from seeing the calls for integrated action and the moves in international policy being reflected in domestic policy. And so there is a need for bottom-up pressure and bottom-up education. And really that's where we come in to the frame. We have arguably the very best examples of how to deliver integrated, holistic action, full stop. It's not just integrated climate and biodiversity action. What we do is good for communities, good for livelihoods, as well as biodiversity, climate mitigation and climate adaptation. But I think we still have a challenge in our own communities to increase understanding of that and to perhaps more consciously focus on those synergies. Next slide, please. So this series of slides really builds on the points Penny was making about the scale of change that's happening in international arenas, particularly. Now this, believe it or not, is these are all very recent developments, but this is actually the first time the CBD actually ventured onto climate ground, pointing out that biodiversity loss and ecosystem decline makes climate change worse. and expressing deep concern that if we keep damaging ecosystems, we'll actually make the climate change crisis worse. So that breakthrough came in 2018. Sorry, next slide. This is a first as well, which is almost equally hard to comprehend. That's the very first time in the review of SDG Goal 15, Life on Land, someone thought that perhaps quality is important, not just the extent of ecosystems, but their condition, and that perhaps biodiversity has something to do with condition and their quality. Now, the last point on that slide that says there's yet no measure for integration of ecosystem and biodiversity values into national planning. Well, actually now there is. That situation changed this year with the development by the UN Statistical Division of a new system of ecosystem accounts, which is truly groundbreaking and probably worth a discussion in this group all by itself. So I won't delve into that, but it is a major breakthrough. Next slide, please. And then perhaps the most amazing step of all, despite the fact that the Paris Agreement does in the preamble refer to the importance of protecting biodiversity and ecosystem integrity, there's never been another COP decision until this one that actually recognised that we need to address climate change and its impacts and biodiversity loss in an integrated manner. Next slide. And this report was an attempt to influence the G20. Interestingly, it's the first one that really puts ecosystem integrity as the linchpin for securing our future. And that's been presented to all places, the Chinese Environment Minister and their Academy of Science, as well as the CBD. Next slide. And perhaps really the most important development of all in terms of breaking down the silos is the first ever joint IPBES-IPCC workshop held in June this year. So these are the two advisory bodies to the Climate Convention and the Biodiversity Convention, and they've never met before to have a workshop like this. And then the conclusions are really unequivocal. Neither crisis can be successfully tackled resolved unless they're both tackled together. They go on to identify the priority actions. The first one seems obvious, but still people are reluctant to actually recognise what this means, is to stop loss and damage to our carbon and species-rich ecosystems. Number one, followed by restoration of carbon-dense and species-rich ecosystems. And there's a long list of them, and Penny identified some, but they do move. Forests, yes, are a very high priority, but so too are mangroves and wetlands and riparian zones and savannas. There's a long list of ecosystems that are where carbon density and biodiversity coincide. And the call really in this joint workshop is to focus urgently on their protection and restoration. Next slide. So you get the picture as to why everybody's talking about nature-based solutions to solve the climate and biodiversity crises. In theory, that provides a really great bridge between the silos of the big Rio conventions and should help shape domestic policy and action. But there are a number of hurdles to overcome before NBS can really live up to the promise that we're all seeing. Next slide. Firstly, there's no definition of NBS in the climate, in the UNFCCC. So it's a term that's bandied about, but it can mean anything that's based on nature, even things that are patently damaging for biodiversity. We do have a pretty good definition in IUCN, but even IUCN has recognised that it's an evolving concept and that we really need to do more work to sharpen it up so that there's less wiggle room for people inclined to use NBS as greenwash. Next slide. There is actually also some opposition to the term in the use of the term NBS in the CBD. And that's because they already have a superior term called ecosystem-based approaches. And I'm hoping all these slides will be made available to you. So if you want to see these definitions, you can. I think probably nature-based solutions will appear in the post-2020 framework, but it's certainly contentious, and I'll go on to explain some of the reasons why. Next slide, please. And that's because of the reason it's contentious is because of the way it's being used in the context of climate change. So most of you will have heard that nature-based solutions could provide up to 30% of the solution to climate change, but it truly is being interpreted to mean any action based on nature. There is a real danger because the focus is on using NBS as offsets, that it will simply encourage offsetting of fossil fuel emissions. And there's an utter failure to date really to understand or promote the important role of most conservation strategies. You talk about connectivity conservation in the climate world and nobody will have a clue what you're talking about. Next slide. So there's a profound challenge for climate policy, and that is to need to recognise and value the functional role of biodiversity in maintaining ecosystem integrity and the essential role of ecosystem integrity for achieving long-term and relatively stable climate, biodiversity and sustainable development goals. Now, this isn't a trivial issue. It's created by the fact that biodiversity has always been referred to as a co-benefit in the climate space. And that means, oh, that's nice if you can get it, but it's not the main game. In fact, it's the main game. If you don't focus on biodiverse natural solutions that improve ecosystem integrity, the climate action, other climate action that you take, planting masses of monocultures of trees, burning forests for power, etc., will all fail as a climate solution. Not just be bad for biodiversity, it's because they're so high risk. And when we're in a climate changing world, we need resilient ecosystems to store carbon. It's no good plastering the planet in monocultures of trees. So there's a really profound challenge here that this isn't, this is where the rubber really hits the road for climate policy, is to genuinely embrace the role of biodiversity and ecosystem integrity in climate solutions, and at least on land and forests and ecosystems. Next slide, please. The other challenge is really created by this, what seems to be a laudable goal of net zero by 2050, but it does facilitate netting out land and forest emissions with fossil fuel emissions. So this has led to quite a robust and increasing science discussion, because scientifically, actually, they're not fungible. And so there's a really robust conversation now about removing fungibility between biocarbon and geocarbon and having separate targets for each sector. Now, we're some way from that becoming reality, but that is the leading edge of the conversation, because ecosystems function in completely different ways, obviously, to geological deposits of fossil fuels, and treating them as fungible has meant a focus simply on annual fluxes rather than the dynamics of ecosystems, which cycle carbon through all their various pools and depend for their stability on a range of factors, but critically ecosystem integrity. So that's an interesting dynamic at the moment you all need to be aware of. Next slide.
Virginia, I'm going to ask you to wrap up soon, please.
Oh, okay, darling. Well, I am taking much too long. So, so I'm going to flip through a few slides, I think, then, Penny.
Okay.
I'm probably closer than I think to the end, but yes, next slide. We'll just skip through these. So I've already talked about the dangers of a net zero concept. The issue for us, I think, because what we do is robust because we are grounded in community and we are paying attention to people's livelihood and their cultural values. So that increases our robustness. We are focused on biodiversity and ecosystem integrity. So that improves the quality of our climate actions. Next slide, please. And we all perhaps need to pay, we know this, but perhaps we now need to pay a little more attention to the urgency of buffering and reconnecting natural ecosystems and improving agroecological practices to rapidly improve resilience and integrity in our landscapes. Next slide. Sorry, I'm skipping through what is the main game for all of us. No, just back that last one, sorry. The thing to bear in mind and to think about in our own work is that any natural areas we have, whether they're protected areas or degraded areas, they are irreplaceable by 2030 and by 2050, and perhaps irreplaceable full stop. So there is an urgency to look at our restoration action in that context of what we're doing to buffer and reconnect and restore the health of degraded existing natural ecosystems. Next one. I think there's a whole separate discussion we could have on funding. Next slide. I think making our investment case, we could do a lot more to promote the multiple benefits that we have and the long-term social and economic benefits, and the fact that we are a low-risk investment. Next slide. And this is really, we do need to showcase the multiple benefits that we have, educate decision makers, and restore and ensure our restoration actions are positive for biodiversity and ecosystem integrity. And one more thing I think we need to do is we need to think about offsets and have principles to guide us, because they're dangerous ground for us. There are circumstances, I think, when they're appropriate, but this again is another conversation we need to have. And it does relate to that conversation I alluded to earlier about whether current approaches to carbon accounting in land and forests are fit to deliver nature-based solutions. And I argue that they're not, and we should be promoting the new UN Statistical Division's ecosystem accounting framework. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much indeed, Virginia. That was absolutely excellent. And I'm sorry if we rushed you towards the end.
Okay,
there was, but I'm the policeman on this occasion. Look, that covered so much of enormous interest to all of us, the international settings that you've identified and underscored, that there is at least the silos are talking to each other a lot more, but and of course the obligation of all of us to do the same, to in our own countries, to really stress that these two things are interlinked in this manner. But also good warnings to us all about avoiding greenwash and misinterpretations of this concept as it becomes the sort of watchword of the moment. I think that's a very good thing for you to have flagged. So thank you very much, Virginia. Now it's my pleasure to introduce, going to Aotearoa, to introduce our next speaker, who is Cecilia Wichira, and I hope I have your name right, Cecilia. Have we got Celia there?
Yes, I'm here.
Excellent, hello. Celia, or I should say kia ora. And it's very nice to welcome you from all our colleagues in Aotearoa. Celia has worked for the Maori environment sector for over 12 years and is currently working as a connectivity activator with Reconnecting Northland, and her passion is driven by her desire to leave a healthy environment for the next generation, where Tana Ta Whenua, I hope that's approximate, the people of the land have the tools, resources, and knowledge to actively participate in fulfilling their kitiaki. Is that right? Kitiaki responsibilities. She is of the Te Rawa and Ngā Pui descent, which are independent tribes located in New Zealand's biodiversity hotspot of Northland. So welcome, kia ora, and we're so glad to have you with us. Celia.
Tihe wa mauri ora, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you, Penny, for your lovely introduction. Before I get started, I just want to acknowledge our Indigenous brothers and sisters in Australia and acknowledge your tupuna, past, present and future, and also the tangata whenua of Aotearoa. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou. So as Penny pointed out, I come from Northland and it is my home. So 6 years ago, I found myself down in Waikato, sitting behind an office desk at local government, doing exactly what Penny and Virginia both mentioned, working in a silo around policy and feeling really frustrated because I couldn't see the benefit of what I was doing to marae and hapu on the ground. I couldn't see it landing, and it really made me have to question myself, why did I get into this mahi? Why did I create a career in the environmental sector? And it hit me that the gap, this thing that was missing in my work in this space was working with communities on the ground. That's what I couldn't see. And so that's why I'm now a connectivity activator with Reconnecting Northland, where my core focus is working alongside our local communities and Indigenous communities. And that's why I'm here today, to talk about building socially and environmentally resilient partnerships. So next slide. So working with local and Indigenous communities. Why should we work with local and Indigenous communities? And so the key thing when you're with local and Indigenous communities when it comes to connectivity conservation is these people are in these places. They live and they breathe their natural world, their natural environment every single day. They know what will work and what won't work. So if we are policymakers sitting out there in the world, they know how it's going to land on the ground for them, and they know what works best. And I think we need to value that more than we do. Their memories are in this land, especially if they're in local Indigenous communities where the people have this is a word I'm finding really difficult right now, generational connections to the land that they're on. So they've got their memories there. They want their children's memories to be there and their grandchildren's memories to be there. And that's why we can't undervalue, that's why we need to value working alongside local and Indigenous communities. Next slide. So when we're working across large landscapes, like the landscape I'm currently working in, there can be many small and sometimes fragmented communities. And they can be diverse from the people who live in the communities all the way through to the challenges that their natural environment face. So it's important that when we're working alongside communities, there's a space to create local connections. And that's something that we foster in the work that we do. So the benefit of creating local connections is it brings communities together. It gives them the ability to learn from each other, share ideas, bring their different skill sets together, and And it also allows them to create partnerships within their own communities, which is quite important when we think about connectivity, conservation, and building resilient natural solutions like Virginia was talking about. Providing opportunities for people to come together and bring their ideas together and to build something bigger and to bring their ideas to fruition, and for them to realize that their values, even though they come from different backgrounds or, a landowner versus a hapu member, that their values can still be the same. And we've experienced that, like in this picture here, where we've got a Pākehā farmer working alongside hapu, and them realizing that they've got the same values and they have the same aspirations for the environment and for the landscape that they live in. Yeah, but one thing I will mention also is that working in communities is quite complex. It's not all chocolate and roses, and sometimes you will come against resistance, or you might get in trouble, and that is part of working in this space. And it's quite important that when we're out there as organisations working alongside our communities, that we're authentic to recognising when we have made mistakes and accepting that and finding a solution to continue. Next slide. Okay. So one of the ways we as Reconnecting Northland work with communities, and it depends specifically on each community, on the communities we go into, is working with the communities for them to create a vision for their community. So the current landscape where I'm working, we have multiple different communities, and we're just in the process of working with them through developing their collective vision. So like both Penny and Virginia mentioned, having this shared vision is a way of bringing everyone together so that they can see themselves in the vision. So this is our draft vision for an area called Mangakahia and Whatatiri. And so we still need to make sure that this fits with the community and socialise that. And so as you can see in this draft vision that we have, there's a raft of things there. And when we think about making sure we're not siloing action, it's things like this that create a platform where the community not only sees themselves, but there's a way for investors potentially to see where they can assist in communities to make action happen. Next slide. So I'm just going to try and get through these quite quickly because I've only got a few minutes left. So the value of Indigenous knowledge. So Indigenous knowledge is something that's created by observation over time. It holds its own manner and value and places us as humans as part of the natural world. So it doesn't put us in the center of it and it doesn't put us outside of it. It puts us as part of it. And that's a real fundamental principle of Indigenous knowledge. We associate our health as a person directly to the health of our natural world. And Indigenous knowledge is largely an untapped resource across all sectors, and making sure when you're working alongside communities, there is space to allow their voice and their inclusion in a way that they want to take place, and valuing that. So next slide. So here I just want to talk about the value of the things that are important in these local communities and what they value. And so here I'm talking about the things in a landscape that might be important to them. So in Mangakahia and Whatatiri, where I'm working, I've acknowledged both the key elements in their environment that they associate to. Mangakahia being the river, Whatatiri in the southern end being their tupunamanga. So these things speak to who the people are, who they are as a people. So it's really important when you're working in these communities that you also acknowledge those things and provide space for them and value them in all the work that you do. And I think I've just got one more slide left. So when you're out there in our local communities and Indigenous communities, there's some things that are really, really critical to making sure that you're building resilient partnerships. Make sure you're a face out walking alongside the community, share with them, be there with them, go to the events, be seen. And that's really, really critical. The other one is building resilient relationships, like I talked about, where, you know, you get in trouble and you acknowledge that and you go, okay, well, what can I do to remedy this? And being genuine about that. And as long as you're out there and they can see you, you know, you will build a resilient relationship with them. The other thing is being patient, because our priorities or our goals or our KPIs don't have the same timeframes theirs do. And it's really important around funding as well, that's recognised that their timeframes aren't necessarily the same timeframes that line up to funding deliverables, that line up to you know, end of the year financials and our KPIs. So making sure that you value, you know, and be patient, because until you build a package where they're employed to do some of this mahi, they're there just as members of their communities.
Thank you, Celia. I'll have to stop you there. That was absolutely terrific. Thank you, tēnā koe. And it's so interesting, and I think a very important lessons there, and about the understanding of partnerships, but particularly with Indigenous people. I think that is a message for all of us. Our countries are rich in Indigenous people, and their involvement in what we're trying to do is critical. So thank you very much, Celia. That was really very, very useful indeed. And obviously you're doing great work. My pleasure now is to introduce Justin. Justin Johnson is the Managing Director of Threshold Environment Company, specialising in large-scale ecological restoration on degraded farmland in southwestern Australia. And he's a leading restoration practitioner, much needed at the moment, and expert in the development, planning and delivery of restoration projects in species-rich landscapes, including those which generate certified carbon offsets. He's a board member of the Australasian chapter of the Society for Ecological Restoration, SERA, and president-elect of the large-scale Ecosystem Restoration section of SERS, and a founding author of both the Australian and international standards of ecological restoration. So he certainly has the expertise, which is extremely relevant to our symposium. So, Justin.
Thank you so much, Penny, for that introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to present today. I'm presenting from Southwest WA in Noongar country, so I'd just like to acknowledge the elders past and present and future leaders. And today I'm just going to talk about some of the technical aspects of the work I do, and obviously in every place you have unique needs, so this is just some of the innovations and approaches we've used here to basically restore land at large scale, which is what CALLANZ is about. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, I work in the Gondwanalink project, which is a large landscape scale initiative, and I work in the mainly fragmented production landscape zones. So you can see the forest just north of Albany there. At the bottom of the screen is the forest to Stirling section, and then there's the Fitz-Stirling section, and also the Stirlings to Prungarup Ranges link. And I work with farmers in all those areas. Next slide, please. So today I'm going to talk about three main aspects of my work that colleagues and I have been working on for the last 15 years. Basically having a systems approach to doing the restoration, so connected to the ecosystems. Also working about the post-revegetation structure. So I guess that would be in reference to sort of like realizing that these plantings are permanent and that what you do at the beginning is very important into the future. And finally, I'll just share some innovative approaches that we trialed. We didn't know if they would work, but just methods we did to try and boost biodiversity. Next slide, please. So as Penny mentioned, and my colleagues and I have developed an international standards. First, it was a national standards developed here in Australia, but the SARE body thought it was terrific and adopted it and modified it into the international principles and standards for ecological restoration. And I just want to focus on principle 3 there, which is basically the use of native ecosystems as a reference model in the context of this systems approach to restoration. And it also is connected to principle 5, which is basically using clear goals and objectives when you're assessing your results. So that's in the context of that reference. Next slide, please. So I'll just use a case, an example of a project I was involved in here. This is a large scale project. That's a 100-hectare project. Bill and Jane Thompson have come over, bought a property, and we did this project. I'll just share some of the elements we use that address those points. Next slide, please. So this is what you're looking at when you get out in the field. That's 100 hectares. Well, you can't see it all, but that's pretty much what you're looking at. It's a bit of agricultural land that the farmers weren't getting much production out of. It was waterlogged, it was rocky. They were getting some production, but it was also in an area that was adjacent to some large remnants. So we had an opportunity to buffer those areas since the property had been purchased by conservation-minded landholders, Bill and Jane Thompson. Next slide, please. So the first step is, okay, we've got this big paddock. What are we going to do? We have to create a map. We have to create a plan on how we're going to restore it. So the way we go about this is we start off by doing a lot of soil surveys across the site. Next slide, please. And for each one of these areas, we mark it on a GPS point, and then we collect some data about what the soil types are like as you go down through the profile to create sort of a 3D image of what the soils are like. Next slide, please. We also at the same time go out with vegetation specialists, ecologists, and look at the native plant systems and record data on what is around the site, what are the species and what groups are they growing in. Next slide, please. And then this is some high level stuff that we did. We tapped into some of the precision agriculture technologies that have come out with gamma radiometric mapping, where they're able to drive over the site with a trolley and map the potassium, uranium, and thorium. It's a geological technique, but the agricultural sector is using it to sort of help define the soil mosaic. And also the EM38, which is the top left image there, which is a salinity to show like how salt affected and how much water there is below the surface. And we basically, sorry, just go back one. So we basically use all that data to record it on GIS to create a map, which is the restoration plan, which you can see in the bottom right image, and 4 different systems that we're going to restore there. Next image, please. So then again, you get the map, but you still have to deliver the project. So there's still a lot of hurdles and challenges to go. Next slide, please. So here in the Southwest WA, there's been a lot of really innovative technology with direct seeding. We have the fortune of having species that have very small seeds and that you can collect in abundance. And so you can basically seed these paddocks just like a farmer would seed. But also you're constrained by the technology you have. And that's, next slide, please. So one of the things I noticed when I came and visited a lot of these sites was that the way they were planted was often the way they stayed. And while you would think there would be recruitment in the interrow areas, there was often no recruitment because the natives would be able to basically capture the interzone with their roots and prevent anything from recruiting in the interrow. Next slide, please. So this sort of got me thinking about the importance of how you put those rows in. And so for instance, if you put seed 2 lines and you put a big gap in between, you're going to end up with a big gap into the future. Next slide, please. So this is just a theoretical idea. You've got a line of seed and you've got the different species coming up. Next slide, please. And so you're getting sort of a competition between different species. Next slide, please. So there might be some rare species in there, say, that aren't as common because you're making a seed mix and you're putting it all in there. There might be a Banksia or something that you really want to be able to showcase, but then it's competing with something that's very aggressive, like a eucalypt or something like that. Next slide, please. So, and we saw that the interrow was not really, there wasn't much recruitment. Next slide, please. So the obvious idea is we need to get these species away from each other and into those interrows. Next slide, please. So if we had more lines, we could spread them out. Next slide, please. And so my colleagues and I decided to modify the seeding equipment we were using to reduce the row spacing so we could try and see if it would work. Next slide, please. And through the years, we continued to build on that and improve on the machine, getting better seeding units, better scalping discs in the front. Next slide, please. And we seeded a lot of hectares. Next slide, please. And the great news is that it works. When you reduce that row spacing, you get a much more natural assemblage, which gives the plants room to grow into the more structurally complex forms. You get thickets, you get openings, and you get opportunities for plants to have some space to grow. Next slide, please. And when you're doing different systems, different seed mixes, each different soil type has a different seed mix. So you're getting a different assemblage of plants that are forming in those, and they have different structural characteristics. Next slide, please. 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 So basically what we've achieved is we've been able to create a diversity of habitat conditions. So we're boosting heterogeneity, which is providing a number of different niche opportunities for the local fauna and flora, and basically invertebrates and vertebrates and mammals and reptiles to find a place to live and to succeed. Next slide, please. So here's an image that sort of shows this conceptually. You've got the 4 different planting areas. Those are actually the tractor passes that you can see, those lines on the field. And the images in the center there, the graphs, those are monitoring plots. We did 60 monitoring plots across this whole site, 15 in each system. And we could see then that you've got a different assemblage of plants and a different density of plants that are coming up in those. So again, just pretty much reiterating what I said before, but the other great news is that some bird surveys had been done and by Citizen Science and Nick Dunlop, and basically they found that these restoration sites were actually outperforming the reference sites, within what is it, 2013, 6 years of planting. And one of the reasons for this is because that young vegetation is so abundant and luxuriant that it's producing a lot of flower and a lot of seed, and the birds are really enjoying it. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to jump into some, so that was the systems bit. Now I'm going to talk about some of the other innovations we've done to try and boost up biodiversity even greater. So when we're talking about direct seeding over large areas, it takes a lot of seed, and it goes, these are big scales. So some species don't produce seed that easily, and the seed is very difficult to get, and it's very hard to germinate, has very specific characteristics. And one of those is, one of the groups for that is the proteaceous group, the Hakeas, the Banksias, the Dryandras. And so what we did to try and boost the biodiversity is we grew those as seedlings, and we went in and hand planted them. So that image there on the left is from the Penny Up project back in 2008. And those dots in the center image are what we termed nodes, which are basically small little patches where we would plant like 30 to 50 individuals of the plant, and then we would go another 50 meters and do it again. Next slide, please. So in this way, we can basically put another layer of biodiversity enhancement on top of our diverse seed mixes. So you've got a seed mix, which is different from its neighboring seed mix, but then you have these little nodes of basically rare species that are interplanted within those areas. Next slide, please. And so as they come up, they form little zones of nectar producing richness that birds can fly into, or other nectarous animals and they can utilize those services and then fly to the next spot, which also increases gene flow, which increases seed set, which increases resilience. And the Carnaby cockatoos, which is a threatened bird in here in the Southwest WA, have been seen. Those are actually that's actually in the sites that we planted. They're on our nodes eating the seeds. That center image there is it's just an image of basically showing how we continue to try and innovate. So those circles are how many seedlings we planted in each patch. So on the left side of the image, you have the 2013 planting, and then on the right, you have the 2014 planting. So that time we did bigger number of species over larger areas. Next slide, please.
Justin, we'll have to wrap it up now.
Oh, that's too bad.
Oh, fairly soon.
Okay, great. Yeah, so this is my last one, Penny. Thank you. So this final bit is about this in-situ burning. So there were species that we basically couldn't even get seed off. So what we did is we actually burned them in situ. Next slide, please. And we were able to get some really rare species coming up, like Dryandra novosa. Next slide, please. Dryandra drummondii. Next slide, please. Dryandra cercioides. Next slide, please. And this is what we're doing it for. We're doing it for the honey possums, and we're doing it for the fauna. And so, final slide. Thank you so much. I hope that was enjoyable.
Justin, that was absolutely terrific. I think you gave us our wow moment when we saw that fantastic landscape after all the wonderful lead up to it. And of course, you're absolutely on target for the key subject we're talking about because, well, there are two key, of course, protection of what we have, but also restoring so much of our damaged landscapes in both countries. So thank you so much. That was really, really excellent. Okay, so we're moving along quite rapidly and we're moderately to time, so that's good. So my next person to introduce is Tim Cronin. And so welcome, Tim. Tim has spent over 15 years working at the intersection of biodiversity conservation and sustainable development, and the last 9 years at WWF Australia. And Tim leads their landscape restoration and protection program, very on target, and has previously led the species conservation program both in Australia and Asia Pacific. WWF develops integrated responses to complex environmental problems that involve the combination of on-ground innovation, market transformation and policy reform, all the areas we need. Tim has also led programs encompassing Indigenous-led natural resource management in Myanmar, illegal logging trade policy and peat restoration in Indonesia, and the responsible sourcing of palm oil. And finally, bushfire recovery in Southeast Australia, which is his principal topic today. So welcome to you, Tim.
Thank you much. Thank you very much, Penny. Appreciate the opportunity to speak. I'm speaking to you from Gadigal country in Sydney, and I'd also like to pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. I'd better jump straight into it. It seems like you're a good timekeeper, Penny. I'm going to talk about WWF's approach to healing bushfire-affected landscapes in Australia. I'm going to focus on three things, all of which are pretty central to today's seminar: protect, connect, and adapt. Next slide, please. Next slide, thanks. Next slide. So look, just zooming out very, very briefly, I don't think I need to talk to this too much. I think Virginia did a fantastic job really positioning this topic within the global context. But, here are some of those really lofty global goals that WWF and others are behind. We talk about a new deal for nature and people. As I said, Virginia's already really emphasised the need for integration, the urgency. The only thing I'll add to what Virginia talked about is the need to get past this false dichotomy we always hear between environment and economy. We hear it a lot in Australia. Yes, we'd love to commit to net zero, but only if it doesn't cost the economy anything. And as we all know, that's just, it's not the case, that the economy is fundamentally reliant upon the environment and not the other way around. Environmental loss and degradation is bad for people, it's bad for the economy, it's bad for food security, it's bad for climate security, and the converse is true. Next slide, please. As Penny mentioned in the introduction, WWF tends to try to develop integrated solutions to what are ultimately complex environmental problems, and they tend to involve that combination of influencing markets and capital, getting on the ground, preserving and restoring our natural capital, and informing policy and resource governance. And generally, without some combination and success across all those things, it's really difficult to tackle the underlying causes of the environmental issues we're talking about here. Next slide, thanks. When it comes to forests and forest ecosystems, we tend to focus a lot of our work internationally towards deforestation fronts. Not surprisingly, this image here, this map, is from a report released earlier this year. It was an update on a 2015 report, really looking at where those deforestation fronts are across the world, looking not only at very recent, but also projected deforestation. The key thing here, the frightening thing here, is that Eastern Australia sits among this list, and it's the only deforestation front within a fully industrialised, developed country. Virtually all the others are in the tropics. We're used to hearing about deforestation in Indonesia, in the Amazon, in the Congo Basin, but the reality is we're continuing to clear our forests in Eastern Australia at a rate that puts us in this shameful list. So we've really got to stop that. We've got to, put a halt and reverse to our deforestation rates. Next slide, please. So very briefly, next slide, thanks. WWF, we've been very, very active in response to the catastrophic bushfires we saw a year and a half ago. We've had a very generous response financially, both within Australia and globally. The response that we've taken strategically has broadly fallen, across three components or three phases. The first phase was, that first 3 to 6 months was getting resources out on the ground to the front lines as broadly and as rapidly as possible. Then we turned our attention really to protection and restoration. Where were the greatest impacts? What could we do to catalyse recovery in those areas? And where were those areas that didn't burn? And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then fundamentally, the entire strategic response was deliberately framed as not something that was just looking at what's just occurred and what can be done in response, but looking forward. How do we future-proof Australia and Australia's ecosystems, acknowledging that those kind of fire events are going to be increasingly frequent, increasingly the norm? How do we get on the front foot and prepare? Next slide, thanks. So as I said, I'll talk about three things: protect, connect, and adapt. So first of all, protect. Next slide, thanks. So we really wanted to get a handle on what didn't burn. I mean, certainly for me, the instinctive response was, where have the fires been worse, and what can we do to restore and recover? But, it became increasingly apparent that we needed to get a handle on what didn't burn, where possible, try to understand why it didn't burn, but more importantly, understand, how and why those areas are likely to be even more critical in terms of biodiversity and ecosystem resilience than they were pre-fires, and get in and protect those areas at all costs. One thing we're doing in that space is a partnership with the Environmental Defenders Office in New South Wales, and a campaign we've launched called Protecting the Unburnt 6. This particular map here shows 6 large landscapes across the bushfire zone that harbour some of the most valuable unburned biodiversity refuge areas. And we're working with the EDO to activate existing legal instruments to enhance the legal protections across those areas. Next slide, thanks. Secondly, connect. Next slide. So we don't just want to protect, obviously, what's not burned. We also, want to look at how can we reconnect those refuge areas? How can we avoid a scenario where we have simply islands of biodiversity, but we can actually promote species distribution, ecosystem resilience, and we all know that connectivity is so important to that. So one of the first major landscape partnerships we launched in response to the bushfires last year was with Great Eastern Ranges. We were fortunate at the time that we were already deep into discussions about a partnership before the fires hit, so we were able to fast track and activate that pretty rapidly. So the first phase of that partnership, known as Cause Corridors and Koalas, really just kind of finished. It was about a year duration, and it focused on 8 different landscapes right across the bushfire affected areas, at least on the east coast, from southeast Queensland into Victoria. And again, it was about getting resources out rapidly, catalysing urgent action, ground truthing, you know, the impacts on the ground. We've now pivoted to a second phase of that partnership, which we're really getting set to launch, and that's having taken a bit of a step back and trying to understand what is the long game here. You know, how do we build on that initial response, that broad action, and how do we get deeper engagement in fewer landscapes, but look at, you know, really important long-term impacts. And, you know, again, connectivity is a huge part of that. And one of the reasons why that's so important is, again, we know these events are going to be more frequent, more intense. And, you know, one of the most important ways that we can help species prepare for climate change is enable their movement across landscapes into areas that are more suitable habitat in the future. Next slide, thanks. So really that kind of segues into the final piece that we're trying to do here around landscape restoration and protection, and that's adapt, that's prepare for climate change. Next slide, thanks. So again, we know that we're looking down the barrel of a 2 degree, 3 degree, you know, warming future. Virginia's, you know, spoken, you know, in great depth about those negative feedback loops and the importance of nature-based solutions. One thing we've done quite recently is we've launched a major partnership in Australia that we refer to as climate-ready restoration. So it's trying to identify ways in which we can give nature that helping hand. If we're anticipating, you know, 2 or 3 degrees, we need to accept the reality that what's always been there is not necessarily going to be the case, and trying to put back what's always been there is not necessarily, you know, the best way to ensure that our landscapes are fit for purpose. So it's applying an experimental approach, testing things like climate adapted seed, climate adapted species. We're looking at some experimental rewilding approaches, reintroduction of small digging mammals, and looking at the role that they can play, for example, in improving ecosystem resilience and reducing fire risk. It's looking at things like experimental planting designs to minimise fire risk. And really it's about trying to innovate, trying to do new things, you know, accepting that there's a lot of science out there that isn't necessarily being put into action. You know, how do we accelerate that? How do we find out what works, scale that, replicate that, you know, and promote these nature-based solutions across the sector. Next slide. That's about it from me. I think I made it within my 10 minutes. Thanks again for your time, and look forward to the panel session.
You did an exemplary job there, Tim, in keeping to time. And thank you very much indeed. I mean, that it is great to hear those sort of partnerships, and that such an important organisation as WWF is leading on all those layers that we need in this area. And specifically on the fires, I think most of us are still living with the trauma of all of that. And part of our task today is to think of how we can make the land more resilient to the fires that we know will come again. My next task is to introduce Professor Paul Lavery, and welcome Paul. Paul is the Professor of Marine Ecology at Edith Cowan University in Western Australia. And Paul's been involved in some of the major marine restoration projects in Australia. So it's great to hear from a marine person, not only in Australia, but overseas, including the Peel Harvey Management Program in the Boston Harbour Cleanup Program. And much of his research has been on seagrass ecosystems, and we all know how important they are. And he has contributed to the development of Western Australia's first state environment policy to protect seagrass ecosystems. For the past decade, his research has focused on blue carbon ecosystems, quantifying blue carbon resources in Australia, Spain and Greece, and advising the Commonwealth Government on developing methods to generate certified carbon offset credits through the restoration of coastal marine ecosystems such as seagrasses and tidal marshes. So very interesting segue into a different biome. So welcome to you.
Thanks very much, Penny. That's great, and thanks everybody for the invitation to speak today. I'm going to start today with a little bit of an introduction into the blue carbon and the carbon dynamics of seagrass ecosystems, and then I'll move on to what I think is a pretty exciting case study over here in Western Australia, which demonstrates some of the opportunities that might be there around seagrass restoration. Next slide, please. So this, no, just back one. I was just going to show you. This is when we put our head underwater and we dive on a seagrass meadow. This is what we first see, and this is what that percentage of Australian and New Zealand people who do get to see seagrass meadows, this is what they would see. But what's of real interest from a climate change perspective is what's underneath this. So the next slide, please. If we go into that meadow, what is underneath those marine grasses is not sediment or sand. It's actually a very complex soil. And that soil can be incredibly organically rich. And that organic matter, you can see that in this slide here. That organic matter is effectively carbon, which has been stripped out of the atmosphere through the water and locked away in these sediments. And it can be locked away for many thousands of years, meaning that they are very effective carbon sinks. Next slide, please. And about a decade ago, that was recognized in a couple of really landmark publications which came out. And both of those publications led shortly after to a lot of interest in this concept of blue carbon, which is the carbon being captured by vegetated marine ecosystems, as opposed to green carbon, the carbon being captured by terrestrial vegetated ecosystems. And this graph on the right is being used a lot, but it still makes a very valid point that if we look on the right-hand side of that graph, we see the three marine ecosystems, coastal marine ecosystems, which are commonly associated with carbon capture: salt marshes, mangroves, and seagrasses. And this shows the amount of carbon which they capture each year, compared to the left of that graph, the terrestrial forest ecosystems. And you can see that we're talking about orders of magnitude difference. So that led to a lot of interest in understanding the capture of carbon in these ecosystems and whether we could restore or enhance or protect these ecosystems. So next slide, please. So a lot of my work for the last decade or so has been contributing, along with a lot of other people around Australia, to getting an idea of how much carbon capture is being done by this little band of vegetation along our coastline. And the figure here shows the output of several years of work trying to quantify that. And I won't go into great detail, but the main point I want you to see is that wherever it has been assessed, that bright green bar is the seagrass component. And so nationally, seagrasses are, of all the carbon which has been captured by the coastal vegetated ecosystems, seagrasses are very important, and that's partly due to the rate at which they capture it, and partly due to the fact that we've got very extensive areas of seagrass in Australia. And we estimated that across the continent, there was about 1,500 million tonnes of carbon captured in those soils. Next slide, please. Yeah, and that every year, those blue carbon ecosystems are trapping an additional 20 million tonnes, which is about the same amount of carbon being put out by 4 million cars being driven around for a year. Next slide, please. Well, the problem is, of course, that every time we destroy a bit of this seagrass or these other coastal vegetated ecosystems, all that carbon which has been trapped in them and all that sequestration which they're providing, that all gets blown out the door, and that carbon starts going back into the atmosphere. And in fact, we are losing these seagrass ecosystems, and quite dramatically. So next slide, please. We've lost, it's estimated that since European settlement, we've lost between 25 and 50% of the continent's seagrass meadows. And there's a big list over there on the right of some of the real black spots of seagrass loss. The photo on the left is really showing one of the most common causes of loss, and that is eutrophication. So we see what was once very healthy seagrass meadow, nutrients come into the water column, the nutrients support algal growth, and the algal growth outcompetes the seagrasses for light, and effectively they're starved of light and they die. So eutrophication has been a major cause of loss, and then more recently that Shark Bay number down on the bottom of that list is a massive loss. We lost about 1,000 square kilometers of seagrass out of the Shark Bay World Heritage Area in a single heatwave event. That's a quarter of all the seagrass in that World Heritage Area, and those sorts of events are predicted to increase in frequency over time. So we are losing them, and that's driven a lot of interest in trying to restore and conserve these ecosystems. So next slide, please. Now, I put this up because this slide allows me to contrast, I think, with Justin's talk, that really when it comes to restoring these sorts of marine ecosystems, we are, and particularly seagrasses, we are in our infancy compared to the mature, relatively mature situation that we saw Justin explaining in terms of the understanding of techniques and what works and what doesn't work. Not only are we in the infancy, but it's a very upset infant, and it is very uncooperative. And the progress today has not been as much as I think people would have hoped that it could have been. Next slide. But the general principles are that if you want to restore a seagrass ecosystem, the starting point is to remove the pressure. And I suppose this is where it ties into the connection or connectivity aspect. So next slide. And the two main ways we can remove the pressure which is causing the loss of the seagrass, and therefore gives us an opportunity to restore it and put something back in that place, are around catchment management, to reduce nutrient inputs into the systems. And I suppose a more point source is sewage treatment. And I think these two measures are critical to achieving the natural recovery of seagrass ecosystems. And they're also an essential first step if you want to actually restore those ecosystems, as opposed to allowing them to just recover naturally. Because if you don't remove that pressure, then the subsequent restoration is doomed to fail. Okay, next slide. Next, that's it. So the efforts to recover seagrasses, apart from initially removing that pressure, initially focused on effectively trying to mimic the sorts of things that were done in terrestrial systems, and that was seen as taking pieces of seagrass and putting them back into the water column, assuming the water column was now of a quality that was suitable for recovery. And so we see sods and plugs and sprigs and all these different sorts of units that were being planted back in. That picture top middle was a particularly expensive piece of equipment which was designed to dig up 1 cubic meter of a donor meadow and transport it to a new site and plant it. And we see on the right-hand side the sort of lump of seagrass that was put in place. And all of these methods have attempted to use a very technological approach to actively restore and reintroduce seagrass into the system. And I don't want to sound like a downer, but by and large, what they do is they create things like you're seeing on the right-hand side, little plugs of seagrass, and the infill and the spread and the creation of meadow is it's highly variable and in many cases quite unsuccessful. Next slide. I think what the most promising thing of recent has been, as recent development has been, is a shift towards working with the plant's biology. So understanding that different seagrasses have got different life history strategies, and they reproduce and they colonize areas differently. And some of the most remarkable successes have been in the United States, where Bob Orth and his team started collecting seeds and putting the seeds back and reseeding areas, which may sound very, very simplistic to people used to working in a terrestrial environment, but this was really quite innovative in the marine restoration idea, because they were just broadcasting these seeds into the environment. But they're seeds from species that naturally recover from the production of seeds and dispersing those seeds. And not surprisingly, they got very good results. Next slide, please. So in Australia recently, many of you may have seen this Seeds for Snapper program, which is using community volunteers and citizen science approach to try to apply similar approaches to some of the Australian seagrasses. It's very labor intensive because you've got to collect these seeds, and you can only collect them when they're flowering, which is a short period of the year. They're widely dispersed, and so there's a massive effort in collecting the seeds and then getting them back out. But these are the sorts of approaches that are now being taken, which are working with the plants rather than taking a big engineering approach. Okay, next slide. Next slide, please. So I'd like to turn now to one example which Keith Bradby asked me to talk to because it's close to his heart. This is the case of Albany in the southwest of Western Australia. So that little square on my map up in the top left is in completely the wrong place. It should be down a few thousand kilometres to the south on the southwest coast, around the small city of Albany, which has got two harbours on it, Oyster Harbour to the northeast and Princess Royal Harbour to the south. Next slide, please. Both of these harbours are amongst those real black spot stories for seagrass loss. During the 70s and 80s, primarily nutrient input to both of those systems resulted in them being physically smothered and overgrown by algae. And you can see those two graphs are showing the decline into the 1980s and even into the 90s in Oyster Harbour, where we lost a very significant portion, about half of the seagrass from the two systems. But what's really pleasing is you see that bounce back that has occurred, and those bounce backs in both systems followed primarily catchment management initiatives designed to reduce nutrient inputs to the system. In Princess Royal Harbour, that was through a drainage system and point source industrial nutrient sources. And in Oyster Harbour, it was more broad scale catchment management for agricultural activities that were providing nutrients. Next slide, please. And what we see now in Princess Royal Harbour on the left is a much recovered and quite magnificent looking seagrass meadows in there. And we have similar things going on in the Oyster Harbour. Now, I really want to emphasise that these two recoveries, we've recovered most of the seagrass that was lost, and that's primarily been through catchment management. So connecting the seagrass ecosystems to what's happening upstream in the catchments. But over in Oyster Harbour, there was a really interesting simultaneous story going on. A guy called Jeff Bastian, who had moved down to Albany, of his own initiative, unfunded, decided to go out and start to transplant seagrasses back in to this estuarine system. The water quality had been improving because of the catchment management, and he'd noticed little seedlings established in the estuary. So he went in, and you see in that top picture, the 2001 picture, all those square areas are plots which he planted out with small pieces of seagrass, of a seagrass which up to that point people had said, well, you know, if you lose this, you can't really get it back. You're talking about many, many decades to get this stuff to recover. Well, a decade later, you can see in that picture on the bottom, there's been magnificent recovery. And that was primarily simply by Jeff and volunteers that he coordinated planting these seagrasses out. If we go to the next slide, that's that same picture on the left, but on the right, what I'm showing you is some of the research that's been done by Jeff and Nuria Marber and other people looking at the accumulation of carbon in that system. And I'll need to be quick, but
yes, please.
What that is showing in those two graphs is that over a period of about 18 years, those restored seagrasses started to capture pretty much the same amount of carbon that the natural meadows were capturing. So next slide, please. So in that 1.5 hectares, which Jeff rehabilitated, 14 tons of additional CO2 were buried over that period, and 83 tons were prevented from going back into the atmosphere. And that was from a very small amount of effort. So next slide, please. So to finish up, just a couple of points I'd really like to make. One, there's a lot of interest in blue carbon at the moment, but blue carbon is not going to be a silver bullet for climate change. It's one of a whole bunch of approaches that we need to take around nature-based solutions that cumulatively will add up to helping us deal with climate change. However, the bang for buck factor is what makes blue carbon interesting, in that you get a lot of carbon in a small amount of space. The co-benefits, which were mentioned earlier, are also a big selling point, in that when you bring back that seagrass, you're not only capturing carbon, but you're restoring all that biodiversity and the benefits that go along with that. There are some pretty considerable financial issues that need to be overcome, though. It's expensive to do it, even with community help. It's much, much more expensive than terrestrial rehabilitation. And the final thing I'd like to mention is something which Virginia mentioned, that the current carbon crediting systems are not particularly well suited to nature-based solution approaches. And I think that's particularly the case for blue carbon. The current frameworks for carbon crediting, for example, are very much built around the model of terrestrial forest activity. And coastal vegetated ecosystems operate differently. And one of the big differences is the scale of connectivity. And that scale of connectivity is completely ignored in these sort of crediting models, which want to work on individual plots of seagrass and what's happening in one particular place, without acknowledging that all the effort and action might need to be up in the catchment, which is well away from it. And so I think that really, if blue carbon is and seagrass restoration is to bloom in this space, then some of the policy frameworks we're operating in need to be re-looked at. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Sorry, thank you very much indeed, Paul. That was excellent. And I mean, really interesting to hear about the complexity of restoration in a different environment. Sean is founder and CEO of ECOS, an environmental financing business focused on Indigenous forest carbon projects and carbon management and zero carbon certification for organisations and products. He's an international expert in Indigenous forest carbon, carbon markets and market-based mechanisms for environmental and climate financing, and a consultant to national and international governments. And I'll leave it at that. Over to you, Sean. And
thank you. Thank you, Penelope. Kia ora koutou. So I'm going to talk about carbon financed Indigenous reforestation at scale in a New Zealand setting. Many of the issues will apply anywhere, whether it's in New Zealand, Australia, Pacific Islands, or anywhere else. We also work in the Pacific Islands on forest carbon projects, and also, Paul, we are doing some scoping work in the blue carbon space too. So it'd be nice to have a catch up with you offline. But could we have the first slide, please? So our key purpose is to turn conservation into a business, mainly because we understand that there's just not enough money in the grant world for forest conservation efforts, but there is, in theory at least, more than enough money in the private sector capital world. So go to the next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah, cool. So in New Zealand, and in many countries, certainly, but using the New Zealand example, there's hundreds of thousands of hectares that need to be reforested into permanent, ideally native forest. From the point of view of New Zealand meeting its Paris Agreement obligations, and also New Zealand developing a more climate resilient landscape that can cope with extratropical cyclones be a lot more resilient. We've also got great biodiversity needs as well. The problem, though, not enough funding in the grant world, to do this, the solution in principle is that there are enough funds in the commercial sector through carbon trading, but in practice there are a number of barriers to that, and key among those barriers, certainly in New Zealand, far less so in the Pacific Islands, I must say, but certainly in New Zealand, is that the carbon economics of native reforestation are very, very challenging. So can I have the next slide, please? When we turn conservation into a business, we need to think in business terms, and finance-wise, that for us involves differentiating between capital expenditure costs, operational costs, and also opportunity costs. So let's look at each one briefly in detail. Next slide. Capital expenditure is building your ecological infrastructure, in this case, a forest. And it has two parts to it. One is a planning and development part, where it's essentially designing the project, developing the business plan and management plan to get it to a point where it's implementation ready, but also investment ready. Next slide. Once we've secured investment and an investor is happy to put money in, then their money needs to be spent actually developing the project. And this will include buying seedlings, preparing the land, doing some pest control, planting the seedlings, survival monitoring, blanking, which is replanting seedlings that died in the first summer, weeding and pest control, and some management. Next slide, please. Next one again, operational expenditure. This is the ongoing conservation management costs for native forests. And fundamentally, certainly in New Zealand, if we don't manage our forests well, they can become breeding grounds for a lot of pest browsers and predators. And so we need to spend money on pest and weed control, otherwise the conservation benefits from these projects is low, and our ability to sustain them is low. From a carbon project perspective, you also need to measure, report and verify your carbon project, and that also comes at a cost. Next slide, please. And the one after that. So opportunity costs are the benefits that landowners need to give up in order to afford to do conservation. So if it's on private land, and our work is on private land or on tribal land and Indigenous people's land, these people have typically, they own land in order to live off that land and make a living from it. So not only would one need to cover the costs of establishing a carbon project and operating that conservation project, there is also the question, well, what did the landowner give up in order to do this project? Excuse me. And typically that will mean they've given up revenue on that land because they've been farming it or using it for some productive purpose. On the margins, there are landowners who don't need to be compensated for giving up revenue from making a living on their land. But for the mainstream, if we're wanting to do this at scale, we need to move the middle of the bell curve, and the majority of landowners are making a living from their land. And if you're going to do a conservation project, we need to replace one revenue stream that they can spend on their family with another one. And unless you can do that, then the project won't get the consent of that landowner. Next slide, please. So fundamentally, these three main cost types are the core cost barriers. And if you can't cover these costs with your funding and your investment, then if the forest carbon project can't cover those costs from the sale of carbon credits because there's not enough carbon credits being produced or the unit price is not high enough, then you won't secure investment, and therefore it won't happen. Next slide, please. So in order to secure investment with a forest carbon project in the New Zealand setting, and anywhere actually, of course, you need to generate a financial return. And now carbon trading can do that, but you've got to make sure that all of your costs are smaller than all of your revenues through time. And if you're borrowing money at the beginning, like getting money from an investor, you need also to pay that money back with interest. And so your returns in your project need to be sufficient to make those returns on investment. We've got a graph here with three different forest types in New Zealand and their carbon credit production rates. Indigenous forests is in green at the bottom, which is the slowest carbon credit production rates. Exotic pine forests are the blue line, next one up, and exotic hardwoods are leafy trees, angiosperms, and they are the fastest growing, and especially if they're eucalypts in a New Zealand setting, they'll grow really quickly. And so we can see that as your different carbon credit factories producing carbon credits at different rates, but they also are factories that come at different costs to establish. Next slide, please. So I want to look at a case study of a 100-hectare project, which is a relatively small project in the scheme of things, but it's a useful illustration of what we're talking about. Next slide. We've modelled here the planting of native forest under different native forest establishment scenarios. So in the scenarios there on the top right, we've got NAF 8000, which is planting native stems at 8,000 stems a hectare. Then the next one down, planting natives at 4,000 stems a hectare. Next one, halving that again, 2,000 stems a hectare, then 1,000 stems a hectare. And then the next line, the last two scenarios, one is where natives are established at 80% of the area. So 80 hectares out of 100 would be native plants planted at 1,000 stems a hectare, and 20% of the area planted in exotics at 833 stems a hectare. And then the very last one is where we reverse that, where the majority of the forest that's planted is exotic initially at 80%, and then 20% are natives. And for the economics of this, we're starting at a carbon price of Kiwi $50, and then rising at 3 different carbon price increment scenarios. One where it arises at $1.50 per year on average. This is looking at the table in the bottom left-hand corner. Carbon price 1 scenario rising at $1.50 a year on average across 50 years. Carbon price 2 rising at $4.75 a year. And carbon price scenario 3 rising at $8 a year. And assuming that we're spending $50,000 on planning for the project. And the graph on the bottom right is showing you the what the carbon price has done in the last year in New Zealand. You can see it's risen steadily. It's above $50 now. And so it's been rising in the last, certainly in the last year, at a rate that's a bit more similar to carbon price CP3, although whether it carries on that trajectory is your guess is as good as mine. Let's have a look at the next slide, please. So here's a comparison of capital expenditure for your different project types, with the high density natives on the left and the low density natives in the middle. And then on the right, you've got low density natives mixed with exotics. And you'll see that capital expenditure on the right hand side is way smaller than on the left. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see what it looks like per hectare, which is a bit more meaningful in most cases. So you're spending between $50,000 and $60,000 a hectare with high density native reforestation. And 8,000 stems a hectare is a common planting density for natural regeneration and forest restoration projects, if that project has been designed by a restoration ecologist. However, you'll find that that becomes very difficult to sustain economically if you're doing it in a commercial setting. And the whole point of commercial here is not to make lots of money. It's simply to enable conservation to cover its own costs using borrowing, using debt financing. So I just want to make that clear. This is not about money making. It's about doing conservation, just not needing to rely on grants. Whereas if you look at the right-hand side of that table, you'll see that the capital expenditure per hectare gets well below $10,000 a hectare as you get to low density natives and then start to mix natives with exotics. Next slide, please. Internal rates of return are an indicator of the profitability of a project, and we've got the 3 different colors for each scenario. For example, at the left-hand side, establishing a native forest at 8,000 stems a hectare, and looking at the different carbon price change scenarios, starting at $50 and rising at $1.50 in blue, starting at $50 and rising at $4.75 in red, and starting at $50 and rising at $8 in green. And you'll see all of them are below zero on the far left of the graph there, the left-hand scenario. As we migrate towards the right, you'll notice the internal rates of return start to get above zero and start to look stronger and stronger. And that's an indicator that these projects on the right-hand side are able to cover their own costs. Next slide, please. The same trend you'll see with the net present value of these projects. It's essentially the same take-home message. On the left, the net present value is deeply negative and commercially is not going to work. The ones that could work without grants are the ones to the right-hand side of the graph. Next slide, please. So the idea is that we start off with, we don't determine the planting density of natives. Well, this is something we do in partnership with the landowner and the investor, because we just need to make projects work. So if we start with high density natives, we could have a very negative internal rate of return. Next slide. If we were to go to medium density, we've still got a negative return, but it's a bit less negative. Go to the next slide. Low density, it's maybe 2%, but that 2% internal rate of return might still be too low to even generate a 2% interest rate on borrowed money. You might need an internal rate of return of about 4 or 5. Next slide. In order to make it work, what we can do is introduce an exotic woodlot, either pine trees or redwoods or eucalyptus or something. Either way, an exotic carbon credit factory produces carbon credits at a higher rate, and it's cheaper to establish. And so this can lift the economics. Next slide. And the next one after that. So as you increase the exotic woodlot, your internal rates of return rise up to a level where the project can actually start to succeed commercially. Next slide. So the purpose of the exotic woodlot in our model is just to fund the natives, and to fund the natives. That's really the only thing that they're doing, and the only reason why we've got them there. And the type of exotics that we'd choose would be determined by local ecological knowledge, local forestry knowledge, and that the woodlot doesn't even need to be next to the natives. It can be somewhere else on the land, or even potentially on another piece of land. Next slide. When we've got this exotic woodlot, what do we then do with it? Well, we start in the first year with an exotic woodlot, all coloured blue. If we go to the next slide, then in year 15, we'd take out 10% and replant it with natives. Next slide. By the year 30, we repeat this cycle every 5 years, starting in year 15. Next slide, next slide, next slide. And you'll see that through the course of over 60 years, you transition that exotic woodlot to a fully native forest. Next slide. I've got a couple of examples where we're doing this, and we're doing this in a number of parts of the country. Southland, next slide. An example where the blue areas on the graph on the map are all native reforestation, and the reddish areas are exotics that will transition to natives. Next slide. Next slide. Community plantings are involved in the native forest planting effort, and commercial sort of forestry on the exotic portion. Next slide. Next one.
Sean, will be closing off soon. We
yep.
must.
It's only one more slide. So that's just an example of the Northland example. Next one. And so this project has 10 hectares of natural regeneration, 75 hectares of native afforestation. It is $600,000 in capital. We've got a co-financing grant of $120,000. Go to the next slide. That project needed that $120,000 grant in order to get it over the line to deliver that 2% interest rate to that $600,000 of investment. Next slide. The take-home message: if we want to do this at scale and not have to rely on grant money, and grant money just simply isn't available at the scale that we're talking about, then we've got to get money at scale. To do that, we need to generate a financial return. In turn, to do that, we need to either get some co-financing grants involved, put an exotic woodlot in, and have a low interest rate. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much indeed, Sean, and really interesting, the nuts and bolts and reality check in a way of how some of these restoration projects might need to work. Right, it's time to get over to all of you and your questions, and let our very capable panel answer them. But I want to introduce, first of all, some of our panel people, and they include our CEOs of Restoring Northland, Eamon Nathan, and Gary Howling, who is the CEO of GR. So welcome to you both. Unfortunately, Keith Bradbury couldn't make it for various reasons from Gondwana Link, but they are the panelists. But I think other people might be able to answer if it was directed at them. Okay, so let's begin with some of the questions that we've had. Virginia, you've been asked about the funding challenges. And could everybody please keep their answers brief, so we can go a little bit past the hour as suggested by Tandy, but we will try and keep it quite snappy. So you've been asked to give us a bit more information about the funding challenges.
Thanks, Penny. And I think that was Louise who asked that question. Thanks, Louise. Partly it's that we haven't established the value proposition of integrated action, I think, well enough. So it doesn't, and I guess I alluded to this in the presentation, I see the recovery of natural vegetation as being a much lower risk in the medium to longer term strategy than the sort of, and it'd be interesting to have a conversation with some of you ongoing about this, but essentially we know that at least in an Australian context, monoculture plantings are actually much higher risk. And you can see this even with resilience to fire and drought, and it's already evidence in Gondwana Link, where some of the biodiverse plantings have already proved much more resilient to drought and fire than some of the monocultures in the similar region. So I think that's a sort of a missing piece in investors thinking about recovering landscapes, is simply to understand that that risk profile is going to be far superior in the medium to long term in restoring natural biodiverse systems. The other thing that I think is a challenge, and this is a much longer conversation, are the carbon accounting rules for land and forest. They're a problem not just in marine ecosystems, they're a problem for all ecosystems, including forests. The rules are designed, the current rules are designed for wood production forests. The assumption is made, even in the modelling, that carbon reaches a peak at about the time you cut the trees down, and it's nonsense. It's just, and the thing that's never considered is the value of actually, really the superior mitigation value of keeping the trees you've got and letting them grow longer. So there's all sorts of things to tease out here. It's not a simple answer. I'm fascinated in the New Zealand model. I'm also fascinated in the carbon dynamics. It's very different for native vegetation in Australia. So that's really interesting. But I think it's one thing to be promoting integrated action, but to not have a financial mechanism or an accounting mechanism that really reflects that value. And so, it's a missing piece, if you like, in the international journey. I know the GEF is thinking about this, and I'm hopeful that there'll be some thought given to this even in the climate space, because the simplest thing for carbon investors to do is just go and plant monocultures of trees somewhere, because they get those quick returns in years 1 to 20. That is quite different in natural systems. Sorry, that's a very complicated answer, Penny, but it is a complicated space.
I think so, and obviously there are differences in different countries too that may be extremely relevant. Here's a broad question that probably could take all day, but I'm going to direct it to both Gary and Eamon in their different countries. So the question was from Mike Thompson: what is our message to Australian ministers over the next 2 months as they set up, well, we'll say that Australia/New Zealand's, as they set up Australia and New Zealand's climate policy in the lead up to COP26. So, Gary, you go first and then we'll have Eamon.
Certainly. I'd suggest mainly a summarised version of the key messages that were embedded within Virginia's presentation, critically about the importance of maintaining the integrity and the functionality of intact ecosystems, the critical role of nature, that the role of nature plays, not just in terms of addressing climate issues, but also a range of other social, economic, human health and well-being issues. We're finding a great deal of the community engagement that we've been undertaking, particularly over the last 6 months at the height of lockdowns, both in New South Wales, Southern Queensland and Victoria, has been very much about encouraging people to find opportunities to engage in nature during those short periods of time that they have available to them. So a combination of maintenance of intact native systems, but also a recognition of those other human health outcomes that you generate, as well as biodiversity outcomes.
Fantastic. Okay, Eamon, what are we going to tell Jacinda?
Kia ora, everybody. Thanks, Penelope. Slightly out of the box, but similar to, I suppose, building on Gary's messages, is really to kind of take a look at the response, the urgent response that's come in the face of COVID, whereby dramatic policy change and mobilisation within the government agencies and from central government to respond to an urgent matter saw unprecedented policy shifts. And the climate change crisis has been, people have been aware of this for decades, but the shifts have been really, really slow. So I'd be encouraging now our ministers to be looking at themselves and how they have responded to COVID and apply the same principles to the climate crisis.
Good, thank you very much. We've had a few questions about direct seeding, and I wondered if Justin might like to respond on that. The question was, is there a profitable business model in selling seed from restoration sites to prevent seeding shortages and bottlenecks in wild supply?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Yeah, that's an excellent approach, and there's a huge opportunity here. I think the term that's being used recently is the restoration economy, and it's basically about all of the various sectors that flow out of this work. So if you do it right at the start with the seed collection, and that seed collection is a whole industry in itself of knowledge that you have to develop. That's the thing about ecological restoration. There's so many different sectors. You have to know about your soils. You have to know about your seeds. You got to know about your plants. You got to know about your machines. You got to know about people. You got to know about culture. Just the seeds itself is huge. And if you collect properly, so in other words, if you collect from at least 20 adults from a given population, you collect from several different subpopulations and create a good genetic sort of source of seed, and then you plant it in a site, you can then go and collect from that site as it grows. So these planting sites then become resources for planting future sites. But if you just use a sort of a slapdash method and just say, oh, who's got some seed, and you don't know the story about it, that could be planted off, that could be collected off one tree. And this is, there's a lot of science involved in this. And one of my colleagues recently came a paper about saying about the value of collecting seed off the old individuals that have been around for the longest and have that old genetics still in their DNA when they produce their seeds. Things like this, you just really need to get that information out there, and then we can have robust plantings that can then supply seed, create jobs for people, create cheaper resources that are abundant, that are in place, that have records, and we can use those to just do the next job.
Fantastic. Thanks, Justin. Well, let's get to the harder area and go over to Paul to ask him a bit more. You've been asked what can be done, sorry, I've again lost the question, to make the seagrass experiment management more functioning, more successful? Is it more science, more evidence, more sharing stories, skills, funding? What are the key elements that really would turbocharge the seagrass catchment and restoration?
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for the question. I think to answer that, it's you need to think about where we're working with seagrasses now as being where we were working with terrestrial revegetation maybe 40 years ago. And so you think about what has allowed terrestrial revegetation to develop in the way that it has. We need to start to think that those same things need to really be applied in the coastal sector as well. And so I think it's a combination of all those things that we just mentioned. The science is critical. Some of the, I think people maybe just don't really understand a lot of the stuff that we take so for granted in understanding the propagation biology of terrestrial plants. It is complete unknowns for many of the seagrass species. When do they seed? How viable are the seed? Do you need to get seed from different places? What increases the success rate of a seed turning into a seedling? What can you do to increase its chances? So there's a lot of science, but I also think, and I've been saying this a lot to the West Australian government, that there's no point in doing that science if you don't also consider the policy and the economic tools that can run alongside it to facilitate and encourage people to invest and to take up those opportunities around seagrass and other coastal stuff. So I take Virginia's point again that maybe the policy frameworks for terrestrial carbon programs aren't ideal. And certainly in the marine space, that is the case. And I think we need to rethink that. And rethinking that would open up better financial models, which would encourage people to do the sorts of things that Sean has been talking about. So I think those two things need to work side by side, science and policy development.
I think that's a very important point to underscore, that, you know, we can get the technology, we can get, well, we certainly seek it, the technology, the science, but that has to be backed up by policy and financing. So all of these things have to go together before we get an effective outcome. I think the next question, there was some questions on bushfire restoration for Tim about the support you got, but I also want to add something onto that, which is we talk about bushfire restoration, but do we have to also accept, well, not accept, but underscore to people that these catastrophes actually create situations which may never recover? That is partly a question, partly a statement. So, Tim, can you respond?
Yeah, sure. Look, I think I'll start probably with your point, Penny. I think you're absolutely right. I think it gets to, in some ways, the final piece of what I spoke about, which was that adaptation piece, and in particular the partnership we launched with Greening Australia and Climate Ready Restoration, which needs to be informed by really thorough understanding of the science. In some cases it will, in some cases it won't. And until we get our head around those differences, then we can't really come up with the right future-looking strategies. It's also going to be influenced obviously by severity. So a lot of our time in the last year and a half has really been thinking through a lot of that and grappling with the question of where the hell do you start? And I think this also gets back to the question around resourcing. You know, we had a really generous response from, across community, private sector, philanthropists here in Australia as well as across the world. WWF's a global network, and as you'll recall, images of koalas and other species, burned was beamed all over the world and provoked a massive response. But even with the amount of funding we were lucky enough to get, the scale of impact was so huge. And so you really need to think carefully about where do we direct that resourcing so that the impact can become, leveraged and amplified, and how can the partnerships and projects we support become more than the sum of their parts? Otherwise, you're only ever going to scratch the surface. And so that became, trying to understand, are we going to try to intervene in those areas that need the most intervention, that are at the most risk? Or is there a triage type response where we let some areas go and we focus on those that are actually more likely to represent the greatest climate refuges in the future? And I don't have an answer to those questions. There is no easy answer, and I think it's a bit of both. But first and foremost, you need to understand what kind of interventions are required in in which kind of an area.
Thank you very much, Tim. And I agree with you. They're very complex issues. I just wondered actually at this point whether particular people feel, all these people who've so generously given their time to us, if anybody feels there's a particular point they haven't made or a point on somebody else's question that they would like to come in with. Celia, you got a very positive response to your presentation. I think we all found that very interesting. Is there any point you'd like to make?
Thank you, Penelope. I think just one final point is that when you're working in communities, you need to have something that can help them achieve what their goals are. And, with Reconnecting Northland, we have what we call a Te Kite Hononga model, which is trying to provide those wraparound services to the communities we work in to help them actually achieve what they want to achieve in their aspirations.
I think that's a great comment. I think the various people have touched on incentives, etc., and perhaps Gary might like to comment on this too, because I mean clearly you and Eamon are both working with communities. What motivates them, what keeps them motivated, because we all know that you can get, particularly if you're dependent on grants, you can get grant exhaustion. And if we want things to be sustainable and communities involved and those partnerships to last, do either of you wish to comment on what are the crucial elements in achieving that?
I'll go first if I may, Eamon. We've found over the life of the Great Eastern Ranges program that simply connecting with people in terms of where they are at a particular point in time is really important. People have different trigger points that can evolve and change over time, and being sensitive to that in the first place and open to being able to work with people wherever they are and in whatever mind frame they're at a given point in time is really important about developing the basis for long-term trust. You're right, people get granted out, but probably equally and perhaps more importantly, people get volunteered out. A huge portion of the work that is undertaken on the ground really relies on people who are doing it out of the love and the passion and as a response to their own sense of connection, the sense of wanting to enhance, maintain something that is critically important to them that relies on their sense of place. So being open, but also inclusive and open to changing our perspectives on what is needed to enable a particular community of practice.
Great, thank you, Gary. And Eamon?
Yeah, I mean, just I suppose to pick up on a few of the threads of Celia's talk around the local connections in the first instance. In spite of, well, communities exist, but there are, whilst we talk about silos of funding and silos of agencies and all of that sort of stuff, our communities have become disconnected as well. And what we've found is that just through the processes that the likes of Celia will work through in terms of creating a common vision alongside them helps to facilitate those local connections in the first instance. And the feedback is that of anything, well, first and foremost, that's the most important thing. Getting to know their mates across the other side of the fence or over the other side of the river or wherever else. Oh, I didn't realise you guys are doing that up the road there. Is really, really important. The second is that the solutions that have been sort of highlighted today are wonderful. They need to land somewhere. And so the values, as Gary points out, within the communities themselves need to be listened to and understood. And our role really is not to come up with the solutions, but to help facilitate those solutions to come to the fore, because the people on the ground are the answer to the solution. They have them because they're in it. And then where there are, I suppose, they struggle to find a solution, we only help to facilitate that solution to come to the fore and or link them up with some of the solutions that have been discussed today and have them land where their values have been identified. And that goes for funding as well. So to Virginia's point, like the reason we look at the kind of the bigger picture is to paint a picture for potential investors, potential agencies, potential grant funders to contribute to that picture where there is alignment. And often it'll be co-funding. But again, we're just kind of the medium to help to facilitate that to land. And there's a demonstration, I suppose, of how that can work, which then helps to inform the policies. Oh, we can see here's a practical example of how this works and how breaking down those silos and working in a more holistic way can actually work, and then work backwards from there, rather than saying, oh, here's a theoretical idea of what would be really, really great. But it's too hard for policymakers to actually grasp that if they don't have a tangible example.
Thanks very much, Eamon. Actually, Sean, you're the good hard head we've got here, who says, you know, that economics is also critical to think about cost and what people give up, etc. I wonder if you have a perspective on that too, about and how much do you think incentives, clear incentives, might play in people cooperating on land restoration and land conservation issues?
Yeah, thank you, Penelope. I just want to acknowledge, you know, Celia's contribution, and Gary and Eamon, and the comments from Justin and Virginia, and you know, and Paul. I mean, this work is very. I come out of this conservation world. You know, I'm a reluctantly dragged myself through the business and commercial space, because in that jungle is where a lot of money is, and I've had to build a bit of armor to survive in that space. But in doing so, sharing that armor with the people that I work with, so that we can together be in a strong position to negotiate, especially with investors, on how they can participate in this in a way which doesn't rip people like us off and doesn't rip landowners off. Because if you go into a negotiation with an investor without really knowing all your stuff, it's very, very easy for you to sign something which you discover later is a big problem for you. So this investment readiness, to me, and this is why we're doing it, to me is fundamental to all of this, because volunteerism is great and we need it, and yet it's absolutely insufficient to deal with the challenges at the scale that we have to deal with them. But it's part of the equation. But the bigger part of the equation is doing things at scale. And so that does require money at scale, and that requires, you know, having a sharp business model that can wrestle with investors. And we're finding we've got investors who are willing to offer money at a relatively low cost of capital. Some of the more conservative institutional investors, like pension funds, they tend to offer their money at a relatively low cost of capital, 2%. You know, that sort of stuff is reasonably straightforward, and we can deliver an awful lot at a 2% return on investment over a long time frame, like 20 or 25 years. So if and when we design things in a way that uses the innovation in science, which we've got plenty of, and then the joining of that innovation in science with the innovation of finance, which is what we do, we can then produce innovation squared. And get access to money at scale without having to beg to governments for money, because governments often, they can hear over and over again, can we have a grant for this? Can we have a grant for that? Can we have more incentives? And that's all very well, but the fact is that money's not moving fast enough to keep pace with the problem. And so that's why we've designed our model to try to just kind of ignore the grant world and say, look, we'll just get on with it. Because last time I checked, it's not illegal to look after the planet. And so it's a matter of just getting on and finding the partners to do it with. And if we don't need government to help us, in fact, oftentimes government will just get in the way and make it harder. And if you've then got a really ambitious impact investment proposition, and you identify the key places where there's a policy change that will unlock that even further, then you're giving a really simple solution to a policy person. You're also helping to identify what you think the appropriate role of government is. And for me, the role of government is to enable private money to participate at scale in this space. And one way the governments can do that is to reduce risk to private capital investors. And one way to reduce risk is to do things like underwrite those investments by saying, if the project is predicted to perform at 3%, but it only performs at 2%, then we as government will pick up that extra 1%. And then the private investor can come in with confidence. Because at the moment, that's the barrier, the confidence of that investor community. And we're talking about big money, people who put many, many zeros after a number, working in the billions of dollars. They're happy. They just want a safe home for their money. And our job is to provide them with that safe home. Part of that safety is where government can say, yep, we're here to help.
Thank you very much, Sean. And it's really interesting to hear that perspective. Can I just ask one question across the board, perhaps to you, Virginia, because you live in the international world as I do, well, a lot of us do. But the UN Decade of Ecological Restoration, it's music to my ears that that has been identified by the world community as a huge priority. How do you think we can use it in our region? And when I say region, I mean Oceania.
Thanks, Penny. Look, I've just been reflecting, in fact, you know, on this whole challenge about resourcing, protection and restoration. And I think we shouldn't underestimate the capacity of governments to actually invest in what's needed. It's a very, you know, so embracing the decade of restoration is fine. What does that look like in terms of government policy and government incentives to participate and to actually really deliver on the promise of that decade? The same thing applies, and I was particularly thinking about this when Tim was talking about knowing what we need to do post the bushfires. Well, some of the things we absolutely know to do now is to stop the damage. And that applies across all our landscapes and all ecosystems, whether you're a seagrass meadow or a natural forest in Queensland or on the east coast of Australia. There is so much that government can do through its own regulatory approach and also where it puts subsidies and where we don't want them and where it places incentives. So I think that's something we should possibly all think about a little more here in this policy world, which is calling at a high level for integrated solutions, the decade of restoration. There's a reframing of our thinking about the health of the biosphere and the sorts of, you know, the things that we need to do to underpin the survival of life on Earth. There's a clear role for our, you know, our domestic governments to play here. So I guess, you know, it's something we, as on-ground organisations, perhaps we don't think enough about what are, you know, Gondwana Link, classic example. We know that fire management and the fire regimes in Gondwana Link are destroying the protected areas. We know that, you know, we all know that weeds and invasive species are a huge problem. These are things that governments can focus attention on and invest in, and certainly provide incentives and programs. It's not a matter of grant funding and feeding things out. It's actually about properly valuing the ecological underpinning that sustains everything we do. So there's a lot to think through here, I think, in terms of what role we play in trying to influence policy debates, influence legislative change, educate investors, and look for some of these innovative financial mechanisms that we've heard about today. So yeah, it's been a really interesting conversation, I think. Thank you.
Well, on that note, I think I might wrap up and thank all of you enormously for offering your time and your expertise to the CALLANZ group. And really, you've all been extremely interesting, extremely knowledgeable, and you know, we really are extremely grateful to you. And also to all the attendees, all the people we can't see. We believe there's over 200 people who signed up. Whether they all arrived is another matter, but certainly, hopefully a large number of people have listened to and are interested and will get the video that we're producing and distribute it further so that people can hear what you're saying on this important topic. Please, just one last reminder to everybody that we do want people to do a little feedback at the end of this. I'm not quite sure how the technology of that. I'll probably get it wrong, but hopefully we can put that through. And thank you, of course, to the people like Patrick and Tandy who are behind all of that, and all the people who are behind all of this and making sure it all works. I think it's worked very smoothly, apart from me dropping the pieces of paper. And I think it's been a very successful symposium, and we are hoping that CALLANZ will have more of these kind of symposiums over time on specific items of interest to you all. So you might like to communicate with CALLANZ to say, it would be great if we had a symposium on X, Y, or Z. So you can do that to the people that you know are behind this. So, and I just saw Simon Neville. Hello, Simon, in Western Australia. All the best to everybody. And I think that's the end of the symposium. So thank you so much.